Hi and welcome back to this week's episode on Amplify. My name is Sanchi Singh and this week I'm looking into the impact of influencer culture on sustainability. Influencer culture and Instagram in general is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, when it started out, it endorsed this #ooted throwaway culture where influencers' lifestyles were an inspiration for many. The way they dressed, never repeating their outfits, hopping across aesthetic locations, the products they used and then went on to advertise on their pages. It was all a culture that was fast, trendy, and cool, and imparted this sense that whoever followed them had to keep up. On the other hand, in more recent times, we've also seen the rise of the ethical influencer. Influencers who use their social currency to raise awareness, demand change, and educate their followers. So in this episode, we talk about the nascent days of influencer culture, their hegemony on social media, their efforts that somewhat border on digital activism but really do stay in the space of creating awareness, and whether their efforts translate into tangible change once we've logged off. Welcome to this week's episode on Amplify. Today I'm speaking to Aditi Meyer. She is a sustainable fashion blogger, photojournalist, filmmaker, creative consultant, and speaker exploring the intersection of fashion, sustainability, and social justice. Her work focuses on decolonizing sustainability and improving ethical fashion literacy amongst people, and we're going to explore all of what that means with her. And if you don't follow her on Instagram or you're not familiar with her work, then I highly recommend that you do that because you are going to learn a lot. So thank you, Aditi. Thank you for being here today. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for this.
Yeah, for sure. So Aditi, can you talk a little bit about what decolonizing sustainability means?
Yeah, so when I talk about decolonizing sustainability, I think it's important that we first take a step back and understand what colonial practice often means. When I think about colonial practice, it's predicated on the extraction and exploitation of resources, whether that's human labor or the natural environment, and using that as a means for infinite capital gain. And so when we talk about decolonizing sustainability, and more specifically like the fashion industry, which is what my work focuses on, it's about looking at the larger systems that have perpetuated an industry that's rooted in extraction and exploitation. When everything is predicated on speed, as it often does in the fashion industry, it comes at the sacrifice of the environment, quality, but most importantly, in my opinion, garment worker health and safety. And so decolonization is a return to ancestral knowledge, which is often a slower, more intentional process. Decolonization means going against white supremacy. Decolonization means looking at indigenous knowledge to guide us. And so it's a constant process, and it's an ongoing question that we need to interrogate how our systems are operating. But for me, it's also a very personal approach. So, for me, growing up in the US, decolonization is almost reconnecting with my cultural heritage and what that knowledge was, especially as it relates to sustainable practices, which, as we know, our grandparents and ancestors always were.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm actually quite interested in sort of knowing more about how your relationship with clothes and how you dressed and what you wore, how that sort of evolved over time when you would have inevitably faced pressures of assimilation, for instance, in the US.
Yeah. So I was actually born and raised in Los Angeles. My father came here in his late 20s to work, and then my mother came a few years later after they got married. And so I was born and raised here. And like a lot of first generation Indian Americans, I felt like I was straddling between two worlds. And I think a lot of the immigrant experience for this season in the US is our parents are kind of tasked with survival. And I think a lot of the immigrant experience because of that is ingrained with what I like to call the soul of sustainability. And so when I'm talking about the soul of sustainability, It's a lifestyle that is rooted in frugality, making sure you could use things as long as possible, repurposing stuff, not only as a cultural standard, but also as an economic necessity. So that's what kind of framed that. And then in terms of clothing, when I think back, like a lot of the first generation perspective is also like you have your parents who are kind of like a time capsule of what their experiences were in India. And then you are kind of navigating this new, Western world that you're born into. So I had a different experience than those that maybe immigrated at a later age. But I do remember like there was the clothes you would wear to school, and then there's like the clothes I would wear when I went to like the parties in the family or the gurdwara or something like that. And I don't think I thought too much of it, but I definitely felt more uncomfortable when I think about my earlier days of being seen in desi clothes and like in my school or something like that. But I will say I did have a strong sense of community, like an Indian community here where I was from, because there was a pretty large diaspora here. And I think when I got to around my high school years, that's when I really started embracing questions of, what are my cultural roots? I've always been someone that has been pretty unapologetic Punjabi, to be honest. But in my high school years, I actually had the privilege to have my mom's parents move in with us for a few years. And I think when I think about my time with my grandparents, that really frames the time where I was really able to hone into this identity and this idea of sustainability. My grandparents were farmers in Punjab. My grandfather, who was in his 80s at that point, would do like the cutest, simplest things of taking any seed of the fruit or vegetable we ate and plant it in our backyard. And then my grandma would be constantly fixing clothes, knitting, like that was her thing. And so I think they had an inherently very natural tendency towards sustainability, even though that wasn't the word anyone used. But they were stewards of the land and they were artisans too. So a lot of that frames my first engagement with sustainability, even though I didn't have the language for it at that time.
Yeah. And how did you sort of decide to get into this space, working as an activist, working as this advocate for rights-based fashion, and because it's quite a unique field, a unique industry to go into, considering that fashion is A, omnipresent, but B, sort of very much premised on perpetuating these colonial narratives, like the reason why fashion brands, fast fashion brands, and even luxury fashion brands are able to make so much money is because they have this constant system of exploitation ongoing. They have it in place. So, and I'm assuming when you started out, there probably wasn't as much conversation or willingness to have a conversation about it as there is now.
Yeah, completely. So my journey in this space was a slow process. It definitely didn't happen overnight, but it traces back to about 2013. So at this time, I was at the end of my high school career, like my last year in high school. And I was never someone, to be honest, that had like a passion for fashion as the typical narrative usually goes. I had a passion for photography.
That's what I'm going to name this episode.
Yeah, that was not my narrative at all. I was all about photography. I got into photography around the age of 12, and it was just like a way to engage with storytelling through my subjective lens. But long story short, like towards my high school years, I started getting more into fashion photography. Before that, it was more so like nature and landscapes. And so fashion photography became a very powerful source of inspiration for me. I would look at the Vogue magazines, the Tim Walkers, the way they incorporated culture and all those different things. And so when I was thinking about what I wanted to pursue in college, I decided to pursue journalism. And so now it's about 2013 going on 2014, and I am in my first year of college. And then I learned about the Rana Plaza factory collapse, which, as you're familiar with, was a 8-story garment factory in Bangladesh that was producing for some of the world's largest fast fashion moguls, and it collapsed, killing 1,100 people, and was literally the biggest industrial disaster of our time. And so contextualize that at the point of my life where I'm starting my college career. I'm starting to think more critically about systems, as a lot of college students do. I'm also kind of growing into like my coming of age as an activist was very much grounded in themes of like human rights, women's empowerment. And I think those were all of the themes that I was quickly realizing intersect with fashion. And so as someone that was occupying the fashion photography interest, I was like, if I want to make a space for myself in the fashion world, I want it to be one that's intentional and sustainable. And the discourse around sustainable fashion at this point was quite elementary. Like, as you mentioned, all of the conversations that we're having now about colonization, race, privilege, socioeconomic status, those were not a part of the mainstream discourse whatsoever. And so I started a blog my freshman year of college, which was a very shitty blog, if I'm being honest. It was just like a knee-jerk reaction to all this new things I was learning about the realities of the fashion industry. But it was a quote unquote sustainable fashion blog. And so throughout my 4 or 5 years in college, at that point, it was kind of like defining my respective voice in this space. And I started to embed topics of race, privilege, and access. And that kind of became my defining factor, in this landscape. And yeah, by the time I graduated college, I was doing this full time at that point between content creation, freelance journalism, and speaking engagements, so kind of more thought leadership stuff. But I was also actively involved in garment worker activism in Los Angeles at that point as well.
That sounds amazing. That's such a great sort of entry into this space. And 2013, right? Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think that influencer culture had sort of like permeated our collective consciousness at that point in the same way that it has now. And I remember, I think it was 2014 probably when I got on Instagram. And I remember sort of that was just, or maybe that was just when I got on Instagram. That's why I knew that there is something called an influencer. And I remember influencers sort of to begin with, they were, especially this space was predominantly white. There was a lot of cultural appropriation going around. Mind you, there still is. But like we discussed, there wasn't that much sort of awareness about what to call it and how to call it out, indeed. So what were some of the challenges that you faced being this desi ethical influencer? You're not there just sort of posting pictures of like wearing gungru with trainers, but if you have done, no judgment there. I'm just saying. So what were some of the challenges that you faced?
So similar to you, I think I probably joined Instagram in 2014. I mean, that's when I started my blog, more or less. And I was someone who did not use social media prior to that point. Like, I didn't use Instagram personally. So when I started like my social media world, it was always like tied to my blog in some regard. But in terms of the landscape, like everything you're saying is so true. At that point, like if I were to contextualize it, this is the age of like Coachella and white girls wearing bindis, wearing kurtas without any salwar kameez and calling it like boho chic. It was very messy. And so I think, where I went to college is in this part of California called Orange County, which is known for just like well-off white women.
Everyone has seen the OC, right? That was like my first introduction to sex ed, basically, because we didn't have that in school.
So I never saw the show, but that's where I lived. So I was thrust into OC, that's where my university was based. And I did an internship my freshman year, basically at the same time I started my blog, for this like fashion brand that basically was owned by white people that went to India and like employed victims of human trafficking, trying to break the generational poverty cycle. And so like in terms of their mission, it was like respectable and great, right? But as someone who was new to this space, I was quickly realizing a lot of problematic tropes that were very pervasive in this very white industry. And so I remember like when this brand would have events, it would be a room full of white women, and the only brown women there were these blown up images of like poor brown women from the global south, and then obviously me in the room. And so there was this weird discord, whereas like the presence of Black and brown bodies in sustainable fashion, as I noted it at that time, were relegated to the role of a producer to be producing something for a white Western consumer. So there was a weird power dynamic there. The imagery was inherently problematic. And as someone who was studying photojournalism or studying journalism and practiced photojournalism independently, I was developing the language quickly of the power dynamics that come with photojournalism, also a historically very colonial practice. And so all of these questions were coming to mind. And it was like, what role do I want to play in this space? And I think academically in my university, I was being a part of more first generation communities of color students that really amplified my discourse in activism and all of these topics of race. And so that's what kind of informed my voice in my work. So a lot of my earlier posts were about things like cultural appropriation and who gets to lead the narrative of sustainable fashion, which are now becoming extremely ubiquitous conversations. And so, yeah, that's kind of what framed the early days of what I was saying. But yeah, I just remember feeling like the token brown girl, but not feeling sad about it, being like, if anything, more power to me for it, because I need to disrupt this space. Because, it's been Black, Indigenous, and people of color that have always been the vanguards of sustainability before it was like rebranded as a Western white luxury market thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, my context is slightly different to yours because I went to the UK for my education. So, high school, undergrad, masters, etc. But it was very much this sort of similar conversation or the similar rhetoric around sustainability then, because I remember, I would say like maybe 2016, 2017, when this conversation was quite new. I mean, I don't have the background in journalism that you do. I'm a policy student. But sort of even when people talked about empowering, and they talked about sustainability or they talked about community development, whether it was specific brands in fashion or food or whatever, even tech, this is a big one. All of the supply chains were based in Southeast Asia. All of the supply chains of these different industries relied on these, sort of very, very thin margins and exploiting the labor of these people. And the conversation that would go around something as simple as modern day slavery, which is, a big deal in the UK, for instance, or even within the UK, the conversation that would go around the act of modern day slavery would be like, we need to have this initiative or we need to empower these people. And it was still very, very removed from actually examining and criticizing the systems that allowed and enabled this to go on, So it was almost as if we have a charity fundraiser, we'll be able to get rid of modern day slavery.
Totally. And I think that has been the narrative of sustainable fashion and fair trade fashion is like, your purchase can empower this starving brown person in the global South. And it completely ignores all of the systemic, historic, happenings that created this system that has disenfranchised and created a global North and the global South. And then now kind of honing into this knowledge of sustainability, which has always belonged to the global South, to say like, oh, we're introducing it back. And so I think it also lends itself to this white saviorism of us white people here in the West are going to empower all of these people with our ability to buy into this global moralism. And it's extremely problematic because it is exactly whiteness that has often perpetuated these systems of supremacy, of colonialism. And now we're having the conversations of how that idea of whiteness has been violent on our own domestic shores, right? We're having these conversations of Black Lives Matter and how it's been white fragility that has kind of perpetuated all of this violence domestically. So I think it's always been easier for white folks to kind of outsource their good human work to the global South because it's a very palatable narrative of like the starving person overseas. But we also fail to understand how these systems of power are literally being replicated in our own borders. And I think that's what brought me to do a lot of my activism locally in Los Angeles. Like, yes, the conversation of what's happening in South Asia is extremely important to me, especially given my lineage. But also, we have a huge industry here that is operating off the backs of undocumented folks. And that's also tied to larger systems of who is considered, native to this land, who is considered an outsider. If you are an immigrant, how your value and labor is undermined and undervalued. And like this undocumented identity is often weaponized against you to create a docile workforce. So I think a large part of my work has always been trying to like bring clarity to all of these interconnected issues and how poverty is often a constructed project. It's not just this random happening. You have to understand what created these systems and inequalities to begin with. And I often say this line that we can't change a problem with the same culture that created it. So we have to understand how race, socioeconomic status, gender, all of these things play into this conversation and make it a very intersectional conversation as well.
Yeah, and I mean, you raised some very pertinent points there. And so I just wanted to sort of go through them one by one. So, ask these questions and sort of see critically on these topics that you're talking about. So firstly, the Black Lives Matter movement. Can you talk about why it's problematic that so many fashion brands jumped to co-opt this movement online by posting those little black tiles, soft, very vacant PR message in their Instagram captions about what they were doing and how they were committed to inclusivity, but how that was all very empty and not at all necessarily reflective of their values or whether they're doing anti-racism work, etc.
Yeah, so I think it's important to note that the Black Lives Matter movement is not new, even though it has a complete rise in terms of our conversations in day-to-day. It's been around since 2013. And it was often, the creators of the Black Lives Matter movement were seen as too radical, and this movement was too political for it to ever, be a part of these brand conversations. And so the fact that now all these brands are jumping into this conversation, I can't help to feel that it's hard to really figure out who's doing it, because they actually have this moral reckoning of where they lie in these larger systems of oppression, and who is doing it because silent means they're complicit at this point, and they're kind of pressured into posting about it rather than authentically posting about it. Racial justice has been something that so many of us have been pushing for, that conversation in the fashion landscape amid many other industries. And we've often been written off as being too political, and brands want to stay apolitical. But we're saying how even being apolitical speaks to your privilege to opt in and out of these conversations. And so do I think it's the responsibility of brands to fight racism? No, brands aren't going to be able to create a systemic change. But in terms of looking at the day-to-day things that make up their own complicit in these issues, it's like looking at who your employees are. How many of those are people of color? Looking at who you choose to cast as models. That's often been highly Eurocentric, especially in the sustainable fashion scene. And so it's good that a lot of brands are honing into this conversation, but I'm eager to see how that's going to translate to structural change, both on an internal and external level. One, who's, making up your company, and how are you treating those workers, whether that is your administrative boardrooms to your garment workers, which again are most likely Black and brown bodies, to who you choose to represent your campaigns, the models, the influencers, etc., and pay them, compensate them. Don't just use the idea of us, but actually look to amplify our voices and compensate our work. Because as someone who's been a part of this landscape for a long time, I can tell you there's been countless campaigns and panels that I've been part of where I am often the only woman of color, and that's a problem, and that's tokenizing in itself. So it's like going beyond this idea of diversity being this checkmark thing of like, okay, we have a person of color here, so we're good. But actually the thing, like, what does it actually speak to of your brand and your positionality in the space at large?
Absolutely. And I feel that is such a important conversation, because sometimes whenever people talk about diversity and inclusion, it can just be, like you rightly said, tokenism. And I wanted to ask you then about, well, I'm going to give you the tagline and then you have to guess the brand. Being naked is the number one sustainable thing. We're number two.
The Reformation.
Yes. I think it's important to talk about Reformation, because Reformation, we've talked about how fast fashion is problematic, right? But then we've also got this slew of quote unquote sustainable brands that are now on the scene. And so how do consumers distinguish between Zara posting a black tile, Zara doing the work, Zara hiring a diversity and inclusion officer, and sort of understanding what Reformation is doing and holding Reformation accountable for similar values, considering they've already sort of got like a little bit of a check mark because they brand themselves as sustainable.
Yeah. I think a large part of that is making sure our definitions of sustainability include racial justice at its core. I think the definition of sustainability for too long has been seen in a purely environmental lens, but the social and cultural elements are key to sustainability on a cultural level, you know? So when it comes to like the Zaras versus the Reformations and both of them being highly problematic, it's like there are levels to that as well, right? And it kind of goes into this idea of cancel culture versus building a culture of accountability. I think the most important thing that Black Lives Matter has shown us is the power that comes with consumer demand. And we've seen a huge increase in a culture of accountability, whether that's, you know, all of these skin lightening brands like Fair and Lovely, to Johnson & Johnson saying we're not going to sell any more skin lightening creams because that's racist, to Fair and Lovely that's doing literally the absolute least by changing their name but keeping the same exact formula. And so I think that's a good example, right? It's like when you are forced to contend with an issue, Zara is a brand that at its core cannot be sustainable because it is predicated on speed and scale at an inherently unsustainable way. They could use organic cotton all they want, but that's not going to make them sustainable. So that's like a whole nother conversation. But something like Reformation's interesting because I was never a big fan. They kind of were really, really good at using the language of sustainability, but also like there's a lot that we could jump in of how sustainable they actually were using viscose and things like that. But what I will say is I have been to Reformation's factory in Los Angeles. I've toured this factory. It is a lot better than the other factories, which are actually sweatshops in LA. So I'll give them props for that. They were a anomaly in that sense, but they also, like their CEO, her name is Yaya, she had a goal to scale at a very fast pace. And so when I went to that factory, that was about the time they actually outsourced a lot of production overseas to meet the needs of growing orders. And they couldn't really speak to what those audits were looking like in those factories in like that weren't domestic to the US. And so I think that we need to keep brands constantly accountable because we could cancel Reformation, but it's also like we also need examples of what this industry can look like. And I think the future of the fashion industry, for it to change and become truly sustainable, demands three main things that I often talk about. It's going to demand a combination of corporate accountability, consumer demand, and building workers' power. Building workers' power is one of the most important elements of this that's rarely talked about. But the most important thing to know is that corporate accountability is pushed by consumers and workers working together. So consumers need to keep voicing it, workers need to keep building their power, and then corporate accountability only pushes its needle when those things are pressuring them to do so. And so, yeah, like hold these brands accountable and do it in a way that actually leads to concrete change, because it's easy for us to cancel behind our keyboards. But the truth is, beyond our sustainable fashion niches, like there are still these beasts that are of fast fashion. So how do we actively think about the ways that we could change those systems to be beneficial for the workers that are going to be disproportionately affected by the end of the day?
Yeah, and when we talk about consumers and how they should sort of stay engaged, what are some of the things that can actually help them in making informed decisions when it comes to making a purchase? So you talked a bit about fair trade, and I'm sure there are other certifications out there as well. Do you think they're handy? Do you think they're useful in informing consumers?
I think they are a good benchmark for folks that are new to the space that don't maybe have the time or capacity to do their research. What I will say is certain certifications, whether it's fair trade or B Corp, is often like to even get those certifications comes with a hefty price tag a lot of the time. And that's something to talk about. a lot of my most favorite sustainable brands that I could speak to what their supply chains and processes look like are extremely small brands, or it's like a team of maybe 10 people. So you know that this idea of transparency and traceability is a lot more easier to reckon with. So I think shopping small is a big thing, because when you could talk to the owner who can speak to that transparency of how things are operating, it's a great thing. But when it comes to these bigger brands, definitely look for those certifications. And there's a wealth of resources online that can walk you through what these certifications actually mean in practice. So yeah, I think they're good, but also think about shopping small.
Yeah. And you mentioned an earlier point earlier on when you were talking about Reformation, about sort of how when it came to scale up, they had to outsource their production. And does that mean that sustainability and scalability are mutually exclusive?
That's a really good question. And I think we have yet to see examples of scalability happening in a sustainable way. I think in terms of scaling operations, when you're doing it at such a fast pace, it's going to cut corners inevitably. That's what speed often does, right? And so when I think about some of the bigger brands in this landscape that have been coined like super sustainable, I think of Patagonia. I think of Allbirds. And so to say it's possible or not possible, the larger a brand gets, the larger their marketing budget gets, which means they could often push narratives. So for someone that hasn't been able to actually explore these supply chains of big brands, I would be uncomfortable to say that it is or isn't possible. But I think true sustainability means that you're operating on a smaller scale inherently. For me, true sustainability in the fashion world means localized fashion systems, localized economies, circular economies. And so scale is often at odds with all of those things, especially when you are looking to find the cheapest margins and whatnot. And so it's a very nuanced question, but I think at its core, the most sustainable things will be on a smaller scale. And smaller scale, not only of how the brand is operating, but how much we as consumers are consuming as well.
Yeah, and there's also, I think, if I could just add to that briefly, I think it's also about just challenging this idea of growth that looks like this graph where it's a positive correlation that never ends, I think so much of growth is just sort of summarized and just left at that, where there's like the space to constantly expand. And I think once sort of brands and consumers, and even in personal life, I guess, if you sort of stop seeing yourself as on a point in that graph, I think that can be a very useful step to sort of start questioning what growth and success means and looks like.
I totally agree. I think one of the biggest things that is part of decolonization is reorienting our metrics of success. So going back to what I said about the colonial mentality of extraction and exploitation of finite resources as the means for quote unquote infinite capital gain, like the world is in dire need of reimagining what success looks like in the business sphere. And the question of whether growth can be achieved without a negative impact on people and the planet. So we simply need a different kind of growth that's better for the environment. And one idea that comes to mind is degrowth. And so degrowth is this like business idea that was coined, I think, in the 1970s, but was always kind of written off as something way too radical for it to actually work. But degrowth doesn't mean the end of business as we know it. Degrowth is actually just thinking about the ways that we can recalibrate the fashion model to be more sustainable. That means thinking about circular economies. That's thinking about, incorporating longevity as part of the product design. Some examples that I can speak to is like Patagonia creating a model where you could bring back clothes that you've bought for them and they will repair it so you could keep using that piece of garment. I'm thinking about Tesla making their practices open source so other companies can kind of learn from them. I'm thinking about Allbirds, which is a sustainable shoe company, collaborating with Adidas to let them know how they were able to achieve a sustainable supply chain. So I think this idea of open education is going to be very important to the future of sustainability and brands actually seeing each other as collaborators versus competition. But all of this requires a complete recalibrations of how we've seen success and growth.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned Tesla, because for a minute there I just wandered off to Elon Musk's son's name, and I was like, how the hell did he pronounce that? So yeah, so
it's pronounced X, but yeah, I use Tesla not as an example of a sustainable brand by any means, but the idea of open source like technology and education.
No, because every time I hear Tesla, I'm like, Elon Musk is such a weirdo. It's almost like a footnote, anytime someone says Tesla, I'm like, Elon Musk, weirdo. But I sort of I need to move past that. I've got a one-track mind whenever someone mentions Tesla. Anyway, so my next question to you was, I know you did a talk on this on your Instagram recently as well, which I thought was brilliant, with Dominique Drakeford talking about how you navigate a capitalist system while you are critiquing it. And if you could just, very briefly, and the talk is there for everyone to see in full, but if you could just talk about how that's been like, what that's been like for you, rather.
Yeah. So Dominique and I are two folks that are quote unquote sustainable fashion influencers, right? And we're critical about the ways that capitalism has evolved from colonial mentality, colonial practices. We are vigilant about the ways that capitalism in the US was born out of a economic system that was meant for white people off the backs of Black enslaved Africans. So with all of these things in mind, you know how these systems are inherently broken, but you also have to obviously navigate within it, because that's how things are right now. And so it puts us in this tough space as influencers often, because the brands that are doing things right often don't have the marketing budgets to compensate us what we're worth. And so how do we sustain the work of educating in a way that we want to continue being accessible and free for the masses, while also being a whistleblower for all of these brands? And so sometimes that's going to mean when bigger brands do come to your inbox that don't have a perfect track record by any means, you kind of have to find the balance of when you say yes and when you say no. And sometimes saying yes is going to dilute the purity politics that we all want to operate within. But it's also like making these tough decisions and thinking about the idea of regenerative capitalism. For a lot of Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, we do not have the luxury of generational wealth. And so how do we use that money, the idea of using dirty money for good, to build the visions that we have for our communities, for a more sustainable future? And it's an ongoing question, right? That there is no one answer. There is no one size fits all to how one navigates capitalism. But it's something that I had been grappling with, because as my platform grows, as people of color become more and more sexy for brands to use, LOL, we're going to have more opportunities. And it's like, I could easily say no to everything, but then there's no way for me to sustain myself. And so I think for people who are following me, people who are consumers of content creators' content, it's very easy to see things as black and white, as, oh, this person has sold out now. But I really urge people to kind of explore the nuance and know that someone working with a brand doesn't mean that individual is necessarily co-signing all of their values. If that person has been someone that has been outspoken, know that they are operating this very blurred line of where they say yes and where they say no. And it's just a question of like, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. That's a whole nother question. Yes, there are more conscious forms of capitalism, but I think every creator and activist has to find this line, because I think as a society, we often normalize this idea of a starving activist, right? Like you either have to pick between sticking with your morals or thriving. And I think that's extremely problematic, because everyone deserves the right to thrive. And it's just a bit more tougher when your work is tied to your public, personal brand image, because everything you do in terms of working with brands is amplified to an audience. And so that chat was kind of navigating our experience and very candid thoughts about all of these things. And my goal was to introduce that to the audience, because I don't think it's a conversation that has been had in the open so far. So I was like, Dominique, come on live, we're gonna just have this rogue conversation. And it was received really well, which was great to see.
Yeah, I definitely learned a lot from it. I think it's great. I think it was just so informative, and I think there are some great tips there as well for people who are sort of looking to venture into this space, like you said, and what kind of balance they should be looking to strike, I think that was a really good chat sort of covering all of that. So I highly recommend listeners to tune into that as well. And before I let you go, Aditi, to go be your wonderful self talking all things social justice and fashion, my final question to you is how you imagine fashion to change post-pandemic. Are you optimistic? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think I am a bit optimistic. If there's one thing COVID had shown us in its early weeks, it's that we were forced to grapple with the question of what do I really need? Especially with our consumption habits. So I think that has been a growing conversation in the consumer base beyond our own sustainable fashion communities. And then when BLM happened on top of COVID, it forced us to reconcile what do we want the landscape to look like of brands, of governments, of public leaders and public figures in terms of facilitating this culture of accountability that I talked about. And so I feel like there is this growing current of just enlightenment and people waking up to all of the inequalities that are in our world today. Inequalities that were always there, but were further made explicit to everyone who might have not made those understandings and intersections of how all these systems of oppression are very much connected. The future of fashion for me, I think, is one that has to slow down and was forced to slow down in the last few months. The future of fashion is one of an uprising of workers demanding they are compensated and treated fairly. And I've seen that change happening here in Los Angeles. We have some amazing policy changes on the way that has been as a result of garment worker resistance. I hope to see the same in South Asia, in Bangladesh and India, because I know that is a huge issue right now. So a lot of that is going to go back to consumer demand. And I think that is a rising awakening. So I am optimistic, and hopefully that's something I could continue to document and push on my own platforms, because it's been really cool to see how these conversations are pervading so many different circles beyond just our own community.
It's amazing to have you on here, Aditi. It was such a pleasure speaking to you. I'm a huge supporter of your work, and I highly encourage everyone who is on Instagram and sort of looking to, move away from just mindless scrolling to actually go and keep up to date with your work. And I wish you all the best in all of your future endeavors. I know that sounds like a work email, I wish you all the best in your future endeavors. But I actually mean it in a very personalized way.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that so much. And thank you for your work documenting all of this and pushing the narratives of folks in this space, especially the South Asian narrative.
No problem. And thank you so much for finding time for this episode. I know that we had to sort of work around some of your busy schedules, but I'm so glad that you found time and graced us with your presence. So thank you so much for that, Aditi.
Thank you so much. Have a great night.
You too. It's morning here, but yeah,
oh, yeah.
You have a great night. I'll have a great day.
Yep.
And keep me posted about your sort of whereabouts. Take care.
Bye.
And that marks the end of this week's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. You can find all the relevant links and handles to know more about our guest this week in the episode description. If you have any feedback, suggestions, requests, or simply just want to get in touch with us, then please do head over to our podcast website. We are available to flag and say hi to via Facebook, Instagram, or email. Thank you and see you next week.